So good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. We're a cozy little group, and I want to welcome you. I'm Rhoda Shermer, and I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Network for Responsible Public Policy. Before we get started with our big program tonight, I do want to thank all of you for supporting us, because without your support, these programs wouldn't happen. And I want to thank some special supporters, like the League of Women Voters of Northern Valley, Jolt of Ridgewood, and Women for Progress. Without all your support and their support, we wouldn't be here. So thank you so much. So as I said, we have a pretty big program tonight, and we're going to try to cover a lot. We won't cover everything, but we can do more programs in the future. So without stalling any further and getting started with the program, our program is Let's Talk, the Politics of Gender in 21st Century America. So let's talk. And Peggy LaScala, our Issues Committee Coordinator, will introduce our speakers. So thank you.
Good evening. Okay, we have a full slate tonight, so I'm going to keep our introductions brief and in order of presentation. Our first speaker, Tova Walsh, is assistant professor in the School of Social Work and faculty affiliated at the Center, she's at the School of Social Work and a faculty affiliate at the Center on Violence Against Women and Children at Rutgers University. Through her research, Professor Walsh aims to identify effective strategies to support competencies in early parenthood and positive parenting relationships. Then we have Dan Casino. He is professor of political science at Fairleigh Dickinson University and the director of experimental research for the Public Mind Poll. Professor Casino's work on the effect of Fox News on political knowledge, beliefs about conspiracy theories, and the impact of gender role threat on elections has been widely reported in the media. Then we have Patricia Matthew, who is Associate Professor of English at Montclair State University. She is a scholar in the New Jersey Council for the Humanities Public Scholar Project and has published articles in women's writing and 19th century gender studies, among others. She has also written on diversity and inclusion for other major publications. Then we have Debbie Walsh, who is Director of the Center for American Women and Politics at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University. The center is nationally recognized as a leading source of scholarly research and current data about women's political participation, with the aim of understanding and enhancing women's influence and leadership in public life. And tonight's moderator is Yasmin Besson-Casino. She is a professor of sociology and distinguished scholar from Montclair State University. Her work focuses on work, gender, and youth, and she currently serves as the book review editor of Gender and Society. Welcome.
Okay. So hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you to NFRPP for hosting, and to all the presenters who I'm looking forward to hearing from afterward. So the question that I want to address tonight as I'm speaking with you is to ask, after hearing so many women say Me Too, what can men do at this time? So from the White House to Harvey Weinstein to all the many stories that have followed in the news, sexual harassment and sexual assault allegations are prominent right now. And Tarana Burke, the activist who started the Me Too campaign 10 years ago, did this with survivors in mind, thinking about it as a way to connect survivors and have survivors feel less alone. But in recent months, as this campaign has taken off, a conversation has been ignited that engages a broader audience. And increasingly, there's a call for men to become part of the conversation and part of the solution. And so I'd like to speak with you a little bit about the work that I've done with men, thinking about how men can become involved as allies in ending violence against women. So as part of a group called Mobilizing Men for Violence Prevention, a team of researchers that includes folks at University of Michigan, University of Minnesota, and University of Washington, we've been speaking with men. We've been doing surveys, interviews, and focus groups with men across the U.S. and around the world for some years now, looking at men who identify as allies in ending violence against women and trying to understand the pathways through which they get involved in this work. And our research suggests that one of the ways that men tend to get involved in this work is through a personal invitation, and most often it's a personal invitation from another man. So when they hear from a man who they work with, a man who's a friend, a man who they look up to about their involvement in this work, they're more likely to think about becoming involved themselves. So something that men can do at this time is to reach out to other men that they know and ask, what they're hearing about the Me Too movement, what they're thinking, what they think the way forward is. But the conversation is started most effectively when it's men reaching out to other men. And the other thing that we hear in our research is that often what really mobilizes men to get involved is hearing a story that's really compelling. And often it's a story from a woman that they know or love. It might be a family member. It might be a friend. Sometimes it's not somebody who they know personally, but it is a story that they hear in the news that catches their attention. And so one of the things that I think is so powerful about the Me Too movement is the stories that are being told and the way they are hitting people right in the heart. And some men are really absorbing these stories and feeling called to action by them. Something that we've seen in recent months is a growing awareness that these stories are far from rare occurrences, but really are very pervasive. And many people have been aware of that for a long time, but in recent months this is really coming to the forefront in a new way. And so a personal connection is another way that people can begin to recognize the impact of gender-based violence and move often from recognizing the impact on loved ones to thinking more broadly about societal impact. Another thing that I've seen in my work is the impact not only of people that we know and love, but thinking about the potential for harm in the future. So I do a lot of work with men in the transition to parenthood, and when I do interviews with men at the time of pregnancy and when they are expecting a baby, often men are thinking ahead to the future. And one of the things that I hear as early as in interviews with men right after having a routine prenatal ultrasound, which is a setting at which I often encounter men in my work, I talk to them and I hear about the fears they have for daughters and keeping their daughters safe, or the concerns they have about teaching their son how to treat women right. And what really strikes me in these interviews is that I'm having conversations with first-time fathers, so men who are still about 20 weeks out from even meeting their child, and these are some of the first thoughts that they have. They've just learned they're having a daughter or a son, and they're sharing these thoughts about how am I going to keep my daughter safe, or what's my role in teaching my son how to treat women right. And these are themes that recur. So in these conversations with dozens of men on the cusp of fatherhood, I also hear about how men want to be just all that they want to be to their children. So they talk about being providers, they talk about keeping children safe, but they also talk about the kind of care they want to provide and the connection that they want to have. Often they talk about wanting to be a different kind of father than they experienced, or not necessarily having a role model for the kind of father they want to be, but having this kind of vague sense of just wanting to be there for their child and be anything that their child might need them to be. And so another opportunity, I think, for engaging men comes in engaging men around the time that they are becoming a father, or later on in their father role, thinking about ways of connecting with men and linking their commitment to their children to thinking about the empathy that they could have more broadly, and opportunities for engaging in efforts to end violence. So from this work that I've told you about, I want to highlight, and I think it's probably up on the slide right here. Now take a look. Yep. So what I put up there is images of some of the organizations that have really led the field in efforts to engage men. And so some of the groups that are up there, you see logos there for organizations like Men Care, Pro Mundo, with the White Ribbon Campaign, and these are all organizations that have been doing this work for a long time. And so, we're having a particular moment in time where these issues are rising to the fore. But these are organizations that have been around and have really been invested in this work for a long time, thinking about the role of men in promoting gender equality and in preventing violence against women. And so these organizations, I want to highlight some of the work that they're doing and show kind of the linkages that they're making. So they're thinking specifically about ending violence against women, but they're connecting that more broadly to thinking about gender equality. And when they think about that, they think not only in terms of women's rights and girls' rights, but also how to help, how to promote boys' rights and men's rights and allow everyone to be kind of full human beings. So they think about opportunities to support men to be involved as caregivers, to be equal partners in domestic duties, and they think about opportunities to engage girls and women, promoting opportunities in education, promoting opportunities for political participation. These organizations are all really committed to partnering with organizations, women's organizations, and so they do this work with men seeking to be allies to organizations that mobilize women and girls, and they think about the fight for gender equality and to end gender-based violence as being linked to ending other forms of violence and discrimination. So they think about issues of racial and economic justice, immigrants' rights, kind of across the board. They're trying to think intersectionally. And so these are some of the groups that are really kind of leading the charge in trying to engage men. And so coming back to this moment in time and what I think men can do, I think there's an opportunity now with the awareness that's been sparked and the empathy that's been engaged by this Me Too movement for men to challenge themselves and other men to think about the way forward. And part of that is acknowledging ways that people have been complicit in sexism and in a culture in which violence against women is endemic, and then moving from there to thinking about specific actions that can be taken. And so following on the hashtag MeToo, there are now hashtags pledging to change that men have started. So hashtags like I will and how I will change, where men are offering specific corrective actions that they intend to take. And through these hashtags, people are working to kind of bring together energy around ending this kind of treatment of women in so many domains. So I think there's an opportunity now for men to reach out to the men they know, whether it's in a fraternity, whether it's coworkers, teammates. But I think that men have a particular responsibility for engaging other men and working to end gender-based violence and more broadly to promote full gender equality. I also want to highlight that what I've suggested here, I'm telling you about some of the pathways that have emerged in our research. And in one sense, it sounds straightforward. Okay, so we need to raise awareness, get people connected, start taking action. And of course, it's not necessarily that smooth. The other thing that we're seeing in the news now is these stories fill the media and fill social media, and people are hearing the stories of people that they know and feel close to, is that often people are reacting defensively. And you can kind of see this thread of people feeling we see the pushback that's happening. And I also have, given some thought and wanted to talk with you a little bit tonight about what men can do who might be reflecting back and thinking about, ways that they may have made women in their lives feel uneasy or inferior or even unsafe. So I think there are men who are responding in that way to what's in the news now, and they may be feeling sad and angry, thinking about girls they know and love and experiences they've had, or they may be feeling worried about things that they might have done to make people feel that way. And I think that energy needs to be channeled into a commitment to not only change ourselves, but challenge other men to do the same. And so I highlight these organizations in particular up here to show you that there's a bit of a worldwide movement of men that's emerging, of men who oppose gender-based violence. And I think there's the opportunity now, and I want to share the call with you to reach out to other men that you know in your lives and invite them to be part of this movement. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I think we'll continue with Dan and research on men.
Sorry, I like to walk around, so I'll be coming down here. All right, so I'm Dan Casino. I'm talking a little about men and gender tonight. And as a man who talks about gender issues, I get a weird response. And the response you sometimes get from students as a man who talks about gender issues, you have students who say, oh good, finally, someone who's not biased. Because after all, women have gender, men don't have gender. And I think this is something that's pervasive in our society. Because when we talk about gender issues, we're talking about women's issues. They're almost synonymous. We're pretending that men don't have gender. When in reality, one of the things we're finding out in the 21st century, in 2018, is that men's gender is far more fragile, far more threatened, and far stranger than people tend to appreciate. Men do weird stuff in order to protect their masculinity. Now, men in the audience already know this, but ladies in the audience might not be aware. When men use the bathroom, they will not use a urinal next to another man who is using the urinal, they will keep a buffer there. They will not do it. They're terrified. They will wait. Why? Because even something as simple as using urinal next to another person who is using the urinal would threaten their gender identity in a way that they can't quite explain, but they all know it. Men's gender identity is constantly under threat. Now think about it. In most societies, we have ways for men to establish, for boys to establish that they have become men. You have a bar mitzvah, for instance. If you are in a tribe in Africa, perhaps if you're a Maasai, you have to go kill a lion. You have to do something to become a man. What do you have to do to become a woman? Many societies, you have to menstruate. Masculinity is something that has to be earned, something that has to be established. And because of that, it is something that you can lose, something that can be taken away from you. You can cease to be a man. Bob didn't act like a man. Bob isn't the man I thought he was. If a man stops being a man, we know what that means. If a woman stops being a woman, surgery? We don't even have a concept for what that is. Masculinity, men's gender identities, is fragile. Now, what I've got up here is a slide showing the increasing what I call ambient levels of gender role threat. And so what we've done here is on surveys, we've asked men whether they face discrimination because of their gender. Now, this may sound like a ridiculous question. You'll note the series only goes back to 2012 because it's a ridiculous enough question that before 2012, we didn't bother to ask it. Why not? Well, let's see. Men control 80% of the seats in Congress. Women have more CEO positions in the Fortune 500 than ever before. They're now up to 7%. We don't ask men if they're being discriminated against the basis of their gender because men kind of run everything still. So why would men believe that they are facing gender discrimination? Why would men believe at increasing levels between 2012 and 2016 that they're facing gender discrimination? Among Republican men, in 2012, about 7% said they faced a great deal of discrimination because of their gender. In 2016, that figure rose to 18%. If we take a look at people who just say they're facing some or a little discrimination because of their gender, among all men, we're up above 60% now. And that's shocking. Men believe they're being discriminated against. This is a form of gender role threat. Men believe that they are under attack, that their status, their privilege, is no longer there. Now, you may be saying to yourself, if someone loses privilege, that's not the same thing as being discriminated against. If you were on top for a long time and now you're on equal playing field, that's not discrimination. That's a level playing field. But you have to remember, if you've been on top, if you've been privileged for, let's say, 3,000 years, when you get to a level playing field, that level playing field feels like discrimination. We have good evidence of this in classroom studies, where in normal classrooms, many classrooms where professors don't do anything to intervene, men dominate discussions. We find that somewhere around 80% of the comments made during the class are made by male students. When the professor intervenes to get that down to a 60-40 split, men overestimate how much women are talking and believe that women are dominating the conversation now, even though men are still offering most of the comments. If you've been on top for a long time, equality feels like discrimination. So what do we have? We have an economy, we have a society where men no longer have the privileges they used to. They're still privileged, dramatically privileged over women in almost every way, but it's not as much as it used to be. And men feel threatened. So, again, we can see this. They feel like there is discrimination. Oh, let's go. Sorry. I should probably turn that on. That works better when it's on. All right, there we go. However, this feeling of increased discrimination is only among some groups. It's among, for the most part, Republican men. It's a group that feels they've had a large discrimination, but we all see there are increases among independent men. And we do see a large increases, as you might expect, among Democratic women who have become awakened perhaps to the fact that they are facing discrimination without knowing it. Among some men, especially Democratic men, we just don't see an increase. They're not more likely to be being discriminated against. Now, why has this happened? What happened between 2012 and 2016? A lot of it actually does seem to have to do with Donald Trump. That is, Donald Trump was able to tap into something that was in the society already, but to give voice to the idea that men are the ones who are really facing discrimination, especially white Christian men are facing discrimination in a way they haven't before. So men's reports that they are facing discrimination is activated to some extent by Trump support. The more they support Donald Trump, the more they believe that they are facing discrimination, or I would argue the other way around. The more you believe you're facing discrimination on the basis of your religion, on the basis of being white, on the basis of being male, the more likely you were to look at Donald Trump and say, that's someone who's speaking for me. That's someone who's going to take back my country. That's someone who's going to help me make America great again, the way it was before. Now, why does this matter? I mean, after all, if a bunch of men think against all evidence that they're being discriminated against, who cares? People can believe what they want to believe. The problem is that it leads to other changes in how people view the world and how people view policy. So up here, we have views about access to contraception, whether people should have access to contraception. Now, again, this is 21st century America. Should people have access? I mean, the Supreme Court handled this in the 60s, for goodness sake. We think everyone should have access to contraception, but what do we find? Well, people who say, men who say they face a lot of discrimination, especially if they are unemployed, they say, no, women should not have access to contraception. We should get rid of it. Why? Because what does unemployment have to do with it? Because those are the men who feel they are being most disadvantaged right now. When we talk to men who are unemployed, they tell us they can't get jobs because the jobs are going to women, into minorities, into immigrants. Now, is that true? Of course not. This is what we call the handicap parking spot fallacy. Right? You're driving around the mall, there's no parking spots, and you see there's a handicap spot open. You're like, oh, if those handicapped people didn't get their own spots, then I would have a spot right now. There's a reason it's a fallacy, because somebody else would have gotten that spot before you if it wasn't set aside already, but it's compelling. And it's driving the belief that men are facing discrimination. So the more men are disadvantaged or perceive themselves disadvantaged, the more likely they are to say we need to deny access to contraceptives to women. It has policy preference. It leads to certain policy preferences. And it's really shocking to look at unemployed men who say they're facing discrimination. We get somewhere around 90%, 95% who say that women absolutely should not be given access to contraception through their employer. Also affects issues that don't even necessarily have to do just with women. And you can say, well, sure, access to contraception, that's a women's issue. I mean, unless men want to have lots of babies, but we'll move past that. But there's other issues too. So here we've got parental leave laws. Parental leave laws are laws that benefit men and women. But guess what? If you're a man and you feel being discriminated against, suddenly you're against women getting parental leave. It has real policy implications. Now, why do men feel like this? Well, a lot of it does have to do with the changes in the economy. If we take a look at what we're referring to now as the Great Recession between about 2008 and 2013, you see the red line here is representing unemployment among men, the blue line is unemployment among women. And we got this big gap right here between about 2009 and 2012, where the gendered unemployment rate diverged significantly. And as you can see from most of the series, men's unemployment, women's unemployment, it's the same thing. We're all in the same economy. It doesn't change that much. But the Great Recession, when it hit men. It hit men hard. Those were jobs in places like construction that had traditionally been masculine-dominated, male-dominated jobs. And those jobs went away. Now, women's jobs went away too, a little bit later during the session, mostly when the public sector, schools and public sector organizations started laying people off. But suddenly you get that big gap. Now, it looks like that gap goes away, but that gap only goes away when we're looking at unemployment. When we're looking at earnings, the gap didn't go away. Men's advantage that they'd had never came back. Those men increasingly felt disenfranchised, like the economy had left them behind, like they were losing out to women. Now, why do we care about this? Again, when men are losing income relative to women, when men feel like their role is threatened, and we've looked at changes in relative income during the Great Recession. Men who lost income, and about 40% of American men lost income relative to their spouse during the Great Recession. So they were earning 75% of the family's money, now they're earning 50%. Men who lost income relative to their spouses became more politically extreme after the Great Recession. Conservatives became more conservative, and the small group of men who were liberal became a little bit more liberal. It changes people's issue positions, not just in surveys, but in the long term. Here we've got on their views on abortion. Their views on abortion became more extreme, as did their view of aid to African Americans. Government aid to African Americans, their views became more extreme. If you lost income relative to your spouse, men who did that suddenly started to believe that, you know what, the government shouldn't be helping African Americans. They believe they're being disadvantaged, they believe they're being discriminated against, and as a result, they want to change policy to try and take back what they believe is theirs. Now, the mystery here, for me, is why would men believe this? We understand why men might feel like they have to do something to reclaim their masculinity, sure. But why would men feel like their masculinity is threatened in the first place? A lot of it, I think, has to do with the fact that men do not understand or do not perceive that women are actually being discriminated against, which is one of the reasons why I believe this Me Too movement is so important. A few years ago, there was a viral video that went around about catcalling in New York City, where a woman simply walked around the street with her phone on and recorded all the men who were catcalling her as she walked down the street. And for a lot of men, this was a revelation. Because guess what? Men do not see women, at least women they care about, ever being catcalled at. Why not? Because it doesn't happen when they're there. Because the men doing the catcalling respect the ownership of another man over the woman more than they respect the woman herself. So men don't see it. Men don't see when women are abused. It happens behind closed doors. It's easy to ignore. They don't see the bad behavior that we're seeing coming out in public now and for people in all sorts of positions of power, because they never see it. Men don't see these things when they're done by other men because they're not done around other men. This has been something that's been in the shadows. And as a result, men do not perceive it happening. Also as a result, many men do not believe that it's actually happening. They perceive this as a threat on them and on their privilege. When they see sexual harassment claims, we do see, especially among conservative men, especially among economically disadvantaged men, that they believe that this is just another attempt to drag men down, that this is another example of discrimination against men, when of course sexual harassment is exactly the opposite of discrimination against men. Now, all of this is a terrible downer, so I want to leave you with a couple of good sides, all right? Good side number one, technology exists such that it is now much easier to show that discrimination is really happening, that catcalls do happen, that violence against women really does happen. Viral videos are bad for almost everything, but this is the sort of thing they can actually be pretty good at. The other thing is that while masculinity is fragile, it's also very, very fluid. A study I did with Yasemin Besenkasino on the stand behind me, we looked at the change in the way men perceive cooking. Now, in general, if we're talking about doing the dishes, vacuuming, when men feel threatened, when they feel like their masculinity is in question, they don't clean. They don't do that. They just will not wash the dishes. I might not earn as much money as I used to, but darn it, I'm not going to wash the dishes. In fact, the amount of time they spend on housework goes down. The amount of time their wives spend on housework, maybe to make them feel a little better, goes up. However, sometime around 10 years ago, that changed for cooking. Suddenly, cooking became decoupled from all other types of labor. Men said, you know what, cooking's kind of a macho thing to do. I don't have to cook just steak. I can get out a sous vide machine. I can have fancy gadgets. I can show mastery. I can show how I know how to do something. And I can make, and this is a way to show how skilled I am and to express my masculinity. So guess what? Now when men get threatened, at least in certain states, we're seeing they're actually cooking more. Masculinity is fragile, but it can also be changed. We can teach men the way they treat women is a way to express their masculinity. And hopefully, we'll do just that. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. And next up, we have Trish Matthew.
Good evening, everyone. I titled my comments tonight, Remembering Memory and Intersectional Feminism in the Long Age of Trump. And it's long age, not because I think he's going to be around. I'm worried about that. But because I don't think this is new. I just think it's bigger and louder than it's been in the past. The African-American poet Lucille Clifton has a very short poem titled, Why Some People Be Mad at Sometimes. Here it is. They ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories, and I keep on remembering mine. Clifton is the favorite poet of almost every black feminist thinker I know. She captures our triumphs, challenges, and bodies. In one of her poems titled Wishes for Sons, she imagines a world where a man finds himself in a strange city with an unexpected period, a single tampon, and no idea where to find a convenience store. She writes about the material precarity of black women in poems like Miss Rosie, and she celebrates our bodies in poems like Homage to My Hips with the line, these hips are big hips. They need space to move around in. And my favorite line, they don't fit into little petty places. For so many, her poem, Won't You Celebrate With Me, is an invitation and an anthem. I will use any excuse to read this poem. Doesn't matter. I teach 19th century British literature. I read it anyway. Here it is. Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model. Born in Babylon, both non-white and woman, what did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. It's a lovely poem. It's unflinching and clear and celebratory. Clifton is like that. But I've been thinking a lot about this short poem, Why People Be Mad at Me Sometimes, as we wrestle in this moment with memories, memory making history, and whose history matters when. I've been thinking about what it means to remember and how memory has a particular valence in 2018. This is a moment when men are forced to remember past encounters from a different position, and when politicians conveniently forget what the president said a day after they heard it. This memory tug of war is not new, and sometimes it feels rather benign. The little-known fact about a memorial moment we take for granted. These are usually reminders of why we have Labor Day or why Memorial Day is in May. Sometimes the push to shape memory feels more radical. Every year, for example, when we remember Martin Luther King Jr., someone steps forward to remind us that the king most people remember today is different than the king who was vilified, demonized, hounded, and unpopular during his lifetime, particularly in the 1960s when he started organizing for integrated housing in the North and was publicly opposed to the Vietnam War. His approval ratings were very low. Someone always asks us to remember which of the senators still serving today voted against making his birthday a federal holiday. And whenever anyone associated with the FBI tries to honor his memory, this year it was James Comey, someone else pops up and reminds the FBI of the letter they sent to King encouraging him to kill himself. The pushback is to point out that celebrating one thing, King, does not erase a troubling past. This might seem self-righteous or pedantic, and maybe those are the same thing, or like some empty exercise. But what we remember and what we choose to forget or not record is a political act. The speaker in the Clifton poem explains what they want without deciding who they might be, and explains why they may be mad. Here's the poem again. They ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories, and I keep remembering mine. It's worth noting here the declarative tone at the end, and I keep remembering mine. The speaker doesn't try, the speaker just does, and it makes folks angry. It's easy to imagine what that pushback might be. It comes in different forms. Sometimes it's the incredibly simple, why don't we have a White History Month? And then someone has to explain over and over again how many basic facts about Black history are missing from the curriculum. And then a Black person, usually me, jokes that we only get 28 days, so everyone should just relax. Sometimes it masks itself by pretending that the act of remembering is neutral and is labeled quote unquote politically correct. Or in the humanities, in the field of literary studies, it gets dismissed as quote unquote identity politics. We say this when someone, usually a student, asks why we canonize some authors, almost all white and mostly male, and ignore others. I'm a specialist in 19th century literary history, specifically the history of the novel. I'm interested in the novels and novelists we don't read. You can think of them as Jane Austen's literary sisters. I do this work in part because I want to help people remember the cultural past as it looked to the many instead of to the few. It means reading novels we've forgotten and spotlighting cultural conversations many don't know exist. For example, did you know that when Austen was writing, the debate to end England's participation in the slave trade was actually fashionable? In fact, it's one of the first public causes middle and upper middle class women organized themselves around. We only know those stories when we step away from the canon. That kind of remembering ruffles some feathers, but it doesn't invite the kind of outrage that is sparked when other memories and histories are brought to the forefront. In other words, the tension between the they and I shifts depending on who we are where we are in the hierarchy. A woman stands up in Congress and tells an inconvenient history that she wants on the record. Parliamentary rules are put in force, and she is silenced, at least in one arena. In this case, a woman stands up to men who want to silence her. And that old phrase, well-behaved women rarely make history, is akin to the political act of remembering what one wants to that Clifton refers to in the poem. That's one kind of push and pull between women and patriarchy. The tension can shift when it's Black women, or Latinx women, or Asian American women, or Muslim women who want a different history than white women. Then we are reminded that we are all sisters and told that we are threatening and angry if we don't comply. These differences, these memories might be considered minor by some. We're stronger together after all. But that approach can obscure some harsh economic truths. Every year, for example, we remember the wage gap, and women's organizations show what it means that women make 78 cents to every man's dollar by explaining that in actuality, women start working for free in October. But that's only for white women. Black women start working for free in August. Hispanic women start working for free in July. These months matter. That wage gap matters, and money shapes memories. Here are some facts. Single Black and Hispanic women have a median wealth of $100 and $120 respectively. The median for single white women is $41,500. While white women in the prime working years of ages 36 to 49 have a wealth of $42,600, the median wealth for women of color is $5. Nearly half of all single and Black and Hispanic women have zero or negative wealth. I think those stakes are clear, but here's how that translates to places where so many memories are made, and one of the major markers of financial stability and cultural maturity, home ownership. Of homeowners, 50% of single white women own their own home, 33% of single Black women, and 28% of single Hispanic women. Of course, you can make memories without home ownership, but those memories feel different in the face of economic precarity. Here are those lines from the Clifton poem again. They ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories, and I keep on remembering mine. In this instance, let's make the they in the poem those who record our history in real time, journalists, writers, pundits, and bloggers. Think of the language we use when we want to point out that something significant has happened. We say, this is unprecedented. Inevitably, in the age of Google, someone, usually on Twitter, says, well, actually, this has happened before. They just don't remember, or probably never knew in the first place. This happened in the Me Too moment, if you remember. Alyssa Milano used the Me Too hashtag, and because of who she is, beautiful, famous, heterosexual, and white, she was credited with founding it. That was in 2017. But Tarana Burke started that hashtag in 2006, and because of who she is, and more precisely, who she isn't, it didn't get the attention or attraction you would expect. In fact, even when news outlets picked up on this fact, Burke was still a side note in history. Time magazine this year names the women of the Me Too women movement. They call them the silence breakers, their person of the year, and Burke is left off the cover. I'll note here that Alyssa Milano was very quick to honor what Burke had done and wasn't on the cover herself. Taylor Swift was, I don't know why. I mean, I know, but you know. And this is how the story about the silence breakers begins. Movie stars are supposedly nothing like you and me. They're svelte, glamorous, self-possessed. They wear dresses we can't afford and live in houses we can only dream of. Yet it turns out that in the most painful and personal ways, movie stars are more like you and me than we ever knew. Now, you could argue that this is news because we pay more attention to famous and infamous people than we do to everyday women or everyday men. And that would make sense. As Rebecca Traister points out, it's depressing to note, but the attention to sexual harassment is as much because we pay attention to the powerful, rich, and famous as it is about what we pay about, it's depressing to note, but the attention to sexual harassment is as much because we pay attention to the powerful, rich, and famous as it is about what too many people, most of whom are women, have had to endure. But here's where it's important to pay attention to Tarana Burke. Partly it's respect for the person who got there first. It's no small thing to coin a phrase, to put it in the atmosphere. Partly it's because too often the contributions of everyday people who are actually pushing change forward are erased. It's important for young people, girls and boys and others who may not identify with a specific gender to know that one needn't look like Gwyneth Paltrow to make change. All of that is important, but just on a practical matter, it's important to remember that memory puts Burke at the start. She started working for social justice in this particular area in 2006. I'm imagining that she has a wealth of hard-earned lessons that everyone would benefit from. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. There's a hashtag on Twitter that always makes me chuckle, even though I think it's not widely circulated. It's hashtag listen to black women. That might come off as arrogant, and I worry that it makes black women seem supernatural. But it makes sense because all too often it's black women and women of color who have to learn to make do with less, develop strategies to succeed around oppressive structures, require community to thrive, and have developed the muscle of caring for everyone around them. That old adage that necessity is the mother of invention means that those who have less, like black women and women of color often do, have to be creative and inventive. They have to be strategic. Their memories, what they remember, shouldn't only matter to them, but to everyone. We can actually be stronger together, but only if we have a shared sense of what we all remember. Things are bleak, I know. I have a lot of mixed feelings about how we are making memories, how quickly we are moving, especially around Me Too. I think these are difficult and confusing times, but I'm hopeful because I see a multiplicity of voices in this particular movement. Intersectional feminisms means that we don't limit our focus. When Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term, it was to center around analyzing and discussing how oppression often intersects, quote, creating unique and varied experiences of discrimination. In other words, it's not just being a woman that matters. One's class, sexual orientation, and physical abilities should matter too. I'm seeing intersectionality in the movement after Me Too blew up. Those svelte, famous, beautiful, rich women bonded together to focus their energy on helping invisible workers, women in service industries who can't hashtag their way to justice. That movement is evolving with everyone's memories there to shape it. There's always going to be a gap between the they and the I, of course. But Clifton's poem doesn't mean there is no progress. I guess that's the hope I hang my heart on, that honoring memories is the first steps towards meaningful change. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, we have Debbie Walsh.
Hi, good evening. So as was said, I'm the director of the Center for American Women and Politics, which is at Rutgers University. And I just want to tell you just a tiny little bit about what we do. We have been around since 1971, at kind of that beginning, right in the midst of the second wave of the feminist movement. And we talk about that as kind of the moment when the feminist movement met electoral politics. It was the exact same month that we were founded, completely not connected to our founding, was the founding of the National Women's Political Caucus. So it was a moment when the activism on the outside in politics was meeting the idea of making sure that women were also on the inside of these institutions and having a voice in the making of public policy. So in the work that we do, we want to make sure that women's representation is monitored and the story is told. So we track the number of women office holders, women candidates. We look at women as voters. Women as appointed officials. We study questions about impact. We study questions about women's routes to office and how they get there and how their routes into office are different than those of their male colleagues. We also make sure that the work that we do is turned into action, either by other activist organizations around the country. So we make sure that our research is completely accessible to the activist community, to journalists, as well as to scholars. But we also do our own programs. So we run a program for training women to run for office, a nonpartisan campaign training program called Ready to Run. We run that here in New Jersey, but we've also franchised that, and it is now in 20 states. We also run a program called New Leadership, National Education for Women's Leadership, which is to demystify the political process for college women and help them figure out ways in which they can enter into the political world, whether as an elected official or working in government or being an activist and an advocate for issues that they care about. One of the things that we do around this issue of women as candidates is we monitor elections all through an election cycle, and on election night every 2 years, we do live reporting of the outcomes of elections for women candidates all across the country. And so we do that from our office, and we all gathered in November of 2016, and I had some bottles of champagne in our office, and we were quite optimistic in thinking that we would see the first woman elected president of the United States. And we sat through, as I think most of us did, watching the election night returns, and every time that horrible music would come on CNN with the breaking news about a new state and what the outcome was, we would see that kind of hope of seeing the first woman elected kind of drift away from us. And I don't know about you, but I did go to bed quite late that night, in fact, early the next morning, pretty much in shock. And I think it's probably fairly safe to say that no matter who you supported in last year's or 2 years ago presidential race, you were probably surprised by that outcome. And from where I sit and from the work that I do and that we all do at the center, it gave us a lot to think about in terms of women's political leadership and the future for women's political leadership. I mean, what did it mean for women's leadership that a candidate who was as qualified as Hillary Clinton, somebody that I think most people would say was probably one of the most qualified people ever to run for president of the United States, could lose to somebody who I think we could all probably agree is probably one of the least qualified people to run for president and to serve as president. And in fact, what we learned from the exit polls was that 60% of voters on that day thought that he was not qualified to be president, but among those 60%, 20% of them in fact voted for him. 63% of voters told the exit poll that they thought Trump lacked the temperament to be president, and again, 20% of those who took that view voted for him. There's great irony for us who study women in politics, because research has shown that for women, this question of qualifications is something that they always have to prove, that there is an assumption of qualifications for men who run for office and men who serve in office. Women have to prove it. And here we were looking at somebody who we all thought had quite proved her qualifications, yet still could lose to somebody who the perception out there was that he was not qualified. I was really interested to hear what Dan was talking about in terms of gender. We had a whole project around our presidential election last time called Presidential Gender Watch, where we were looking at the issue of gender and how gender played out in the 2016 election. And we talked a lot about the fact and had to remind people all the time that gender isn't just women, that gender is both masculinity and femininity. And we talked about who used gender and how gender played out. You know, the accusation was hurled at Hillary Clinton by Donald Trump that she played the gender card, right? And in fact, when you really look at the whole election cycle, Donald Trump played the gender card, and he played it repeatedly. He would constantly, you know, the sort of the default image of who is a leader and certainly who is president of the United States is male, but it's always been about the toughness and the strongness. I mean, think back to George Washington on his big white steed, right? I mean, this is about masculinity and asserting masculinity. And Donald Trump asserted his masculinity throughout. He did it in the primary against the men he was running against. You all remember Little Marco. You remember Low Energy Jeb, right? This was all about him being tough and him being strong. And he used it against the women that he ran against. He used it against Carly Fiorina. In the Republican primary, he talked about the fact that she simply didn't look presidential, and who could elect that face to be president of the United States? And he certainly used it against Hillary Clinton at almost every turn, talked about her low stamina, tried to constantly talk about her not being tough enough, not being strong enough. And he talked about the fact that she, if she weren't a woman running at that point, she would not even have 5% in the polls. So he attributed it all to her gender. I think her response to this issue of playing the gender card that he would hurl at her at almost every turn was kind of strategically terrific. She embraced it. I don't know how many of you bought your gender card, but she talked about the fact that if standing up for women's rights and access to health care and paid family leave and on and on and on, if all of those things meant playing the gender card, she said, then deal me in. So I think you had a really interesting case there of watching gender play out both for the woman candidate, but particularly for the male candidate. But in any case, I woke up the day after the election with all kinds of concerns about our work and what we would be doing next and how we would be moving forward. And one of the first things I thought about was, you know, how are we going to actually go out there and talk to women about how they should run for office? We were actually in the midst at that time of planning our Ready to Run nonpartisan campaign training program for women right here in New Jersey. We had just started advertising for the March program just earlier in the month of October, and I really feared that women would be so disgusted with the tone and the tenor of the campaign that they would give up on politics, and that they might also think, if a woman as qualified as Hillary Clinton cannot win election, then what on earth would make me think that I could run for office? I thought there was a very good chance that women might crawl under the covers and completely disengage from politics. I will tell you that usually by December, the end of December, we will have about 2 or 3 paid registrations for Ready to Run. People put off doing things, right? So the program's in March, they wait until January or February. Starting on the day after the election, as we were literally sitting in our offices watching Hillary Clinton concede the election, we started to see registrations for Ready to Run coming in. By the end of December, we had over 100 paid registrations, quite an increase from our usual 2 or 3. By early February, we were at capacity in the space we had for our training, so we had to move to a larger venue. Even then, we sold out with 270 participants. We had to close down registration, and if we actually had the space, we could have registered probably another 100 women who were waiting to be admitted. Normally we get 150 women coming, so we had quite an increase in the number of women. I tell you that story not to brag about our program, although it is a fantastic program, and if any of you were thinking about running for office in the future or becoming more politically engaged or seeking a political appointment, I urge you to participate in the program this year. But I tell you this because it's a small window on what we started to see happening as a result of the 2016 election. And it didn't just happen in blue New Jersey. We have partner programs in Utah, in Oklahoma, in Iowa, in Pennsylvania, both in Pittsburgh and in Philadelphia. We were seeing this. All of our programs were telling the same story, that they were being sold out, they needed to move to larger venues. They really had to figure out ways to accommodate this surge of women who really wanted to participate. Across the country, we were seeing women engage in politics in ways that we simply hadn't seen before. We were seeing that women were telling us stories about how they had not been participating before, they didn't want to focus on politics, this wasn't something that was always an interest to them, but with the election of Donald Trump, they felt a kind of a fear and a responsibility to step up. They felt that they could no longer sit on the sidelines, they had to engage and find a way to have their own voice, to have agency, to be able to speak up and speak out and figure out a way to take care of the issues that they were quite certain were going to be vulnerable in this new administration. They were really feeling they had a responsibility in some ways to their families and to their communities. We run 3 programs as part of Ready to Run to encourage more women of color to participate. A program for African American women, Latinas, and Asian Pacific Island women in the state of New Jersey. We had one Muslim woman who came to us and said, I have never been involved in politics before, but with the election of Donald Trump, I am afraid for my children, and I have to figure out a way that I can engage in the process. It really, it is something that we are seeing and we continue to see. Women are really feeling compelled to get off the sidelines. There's a great saying in politics, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. And I think that's what a lot of women were feeling all across the country. I want to share a few other notable numbers that reflect the kind of energetic engagement that we have seen since last year, and particularly since last year's March. As I was saying, we started to see the beginnings of this early on with our campaign trainings. The Women's March, both in Washington and all across the country, was clearly the big kickoff to seeing this kind of tremendous surge and level of engagement and excitement that we have not ever really seen before. As I say, obviously our numbers of women who participated in our Ready to Run program are an example, as well as the programs all across the country. We did see there was a training that actually happened in Washington the day after the Women's March, sponsored by Emily's List and a group called Higher Heights, which is a PAC to encourage and support Black women running for office. They had over 500 women who showed up that day to learn more about how to run for office. We saw 52 women who ran for the House of Delegates in Virginia. That was a 60% increase in the number of women running for office in the state of Virginia. There were only 2 states with legislative races this year, last year, New Jersey and Virginia. We saw some real change in Virginia. So again, a 60% increase in the number of women candidates compared to 2013 or to 2009. The record number of women at the end of the day, 28, who were elected in 2017 to the Virginia House of Delegates, bringing the number and the proportion of women in the legislature from 19.3% to 27%. In one election cycle. And included among the women winners were the first Latinas and the first Asian American women in the Virginia legislature, as well as the first openly transgender woman elected to a state legislature nationwide. Of the 12 new women in the Virginia House of Delegates, 9 defeated incumbents. And I want to tell you that that is completely outside of the conventional wisdom about politics. When we were looking at those numbers of women who were running for the Virginia House of Delegates, we were very cautious, and we said, oh, but so many of those women are running as challengers. Incumbents win about 95% of the time, so let's not get everybody's hopes up too soon that we're going to see overnight change. Well, in fact, 30% of the women who ran as challengers won, really defying the conventional wisdom. But I suppose the election of Donald Trump as president also defied conventional wisdom. So I think we all have to start thinking about politics and our assumptions about campaigns and elections a little bit differently. We also had 8 women elected in 2017 or appointed to serve as mayors of the top 100 largest cities in the United States. Of those, 5 are women of color, including the first Black women mayors of Charlotte, Baton Rouge, New Orleans, and San Francisco. Today, 23 of the 100 mayors, those 100 mayors of top cities are women, and they include 10 women of color. And then one of my favorite numbers is 1. We have here in New Jersey a new lieutenant governor, Sheila Oliver, and she becomes the first woman of color ever elected to statewide office in the state of New Jersey, and the first Black Democratic woman to serve as lieutenant governor anywhere in the country. She is also, by the way, also the first and only woman of color to serve as Speaker of the New Jersey State Assembly. So that's sort of what we saw in terms of women's participation in politics just in that first year. Here's what's coming up, and I think what's happening as we move forward is what we all want to talk about. Where are we going and what's happening this year and as we move forward? First of all, in the very first special election of 2018, which was in Wisconsin, state legislative seat, a woman was running in that special election as a Democrat. She beat the Republican. This was an open seat. It was a special election. But this district was a district that has long been held by the Republican Party. So I think this portends to something that is coming down the road as we look to 2018. This is not just women, and particularly Democratic women, winning in Democratic districts. These are Democratic women who are running and unseating or turning around districts that had long been Republican. We've also been seeing some interesting things happening right here in our own state with our new governor, Governor Murphy, who has been putting together his cabinet. The cabinet is still not complete, but I will tell you, we run a program called the Bipartisan Coalition for Women's Appointments, where we work to encourage when there is an open gubernatorial seat, the gubernatorial candidates and then the new governor, we work very hard to encourage that person to appoint women as often as possible so that we can ultimately achieve some kind of political parity. And we work with a group of women leaders in both parties to put forward resumes and names of women because we want to take away that excuse of, oh, I really wanted to appoint women, but I simply couldn't find them. So we help them find them. But so far, of the people that he has appointed to his cabinet, 47% of them right now are women. There's still about 6 slots open, and 50% of the women that he has appointed are women of color. There actually have been a lot of terrible jokes going around. If you look at all of the folks that he's been appointing, this speaks a little bit to Dan's point, where a lot of men are feeling like they're not being well represented, even though they're still over 50% of the cabinet so far. But also, Governor Murphy is doing an extraordinary job of making sure that there is racial and ethnic diversity among all of his appointees. So someone came up to me, and it actually speaks to what Dan was saying, came up to me and said, well, are you going to have a bipartisan coalition for the appointment of white men? You know, this is just terrible jokes. But that feeling is out there. So I was also relating to what Dan was saying because We hear all the time, oh, there are lots of women in Congress, there are lots of women in politics, and we have to remind the folks who say that, well, women make up less than a quarter of elected officials at any level of office. So we are clearly not even close to being at political parity. Now, I can't see what's up there, so you're going to have to tell me if the slide that I'm about to show is in fact the slide that I think is up there. But does that say 2018 likely Senate candidates? Oh, so it's working. Okay, so right now we are seeing 439 women who are running, saying that they are likely candidates for the United States Congress. What I'm showing you right now is where we are with the Senate. We have 49 women who say they want to run for the United States Senate. We have filing deadlines have only passed in 2 states, in Texas and in Illinois. But we are already at 49. We anticipate that most, if not all of these women, in fact, will file. And you can see up there the record to beat is 40. So we are very likely to beat the record for women who are going to at least be running in the primaries nationally for the United States Senate. Here you can see a little bit of the party disparity. 31 Democrats and 18 Republicans. I'm going to get back to that issue of party disparity in a minute. Tell me, does it now say likely U.S. House candidates? Oh, good. Okay, so this is where we're really seeing an unbelievable surge. So we now have 390 women across the country who have stepped up and said they want to run for the United States House of Representatives. The record to beat is 298. We are more than double the number of women who filed for the U.S. House in 2016. And here you really see the party disparity. 314 Democrats, 76 Republicans. Now, I will tell you that this surge that we are seeing nationally is really being driven on the Democratic side, but it is also true that Democratic women are doing much better when it comes to their representation in Congress and in state legislatures. So for instance, right now in Congress, women make up about a third of the entire Democratic caucus in Congress, whereas women make up only about 10% of the Republican caucus. Republican women are underrepresented. When we have done research looking at the impact of women in office, where we have interviewed almost all of the current, or the women who served in the 114th Congress, both the Democratic women and the Republican women told us that they wish that there were more Republican women in Congress, that there were more women who they could work with across the aisle, and the Republican women wishing that there were more women like them who could help carry the water on some issues, because very often there are no women in the leadership meetings in the Republican caucus. There's only one woman who chairs a committee in the U.S. House of Representatives right now. And so Republican women's voices are really quite muted. But this election cycle is not going to turn that around. We are actually down in the number of Republican women who say they want to run for the U.S. House this year, at the same moment that we're just through the roof when it comes to Democratic women. And finally, the gubernatorial level, which doesn't get as much play. Oh, did I go the wrong direction? You're such a good audience. Thank you for your help. So at the gubernatorial level, right now there are 36 states that have gubernatorial races. This is a very big year for governors. Right now, currently, there are only 6 women who serve as governor in the United States. 2 of those women are not running for re-election. The most women we have ever had at any one time serving as governor are 9. Right now, we have 79 women who say they want to run for governor. 34 is the record to beat. We're going to beat that record. But what's really interesting to me here are the number of women who are running for open seats. I'm going to go back just for a second so that you see Am I on House? Am I on U.S. House right now? Okay, so when you see there the challengers, 197 of the 390 women are running as challengers. That means if they win their primaries, they're going to be taking on an incumbent of the other party in the general election. Those are still tough races. I know what I just said about Virginia. We don't know if how that's going to continue to play out, but it is still an advantage, a great advantage to be an incumbent. But when we look, am I now on governors? When you look at the governors, you can see 51 of those women are running for open seats. Now, many of these women are running in races against each other. I consider that a quality problem when we get to the point where we have women running against each other in races. I don't consider that to be a negative. But we have some real opportunities here. We just did a little handicapping of the governor's races, and we think there could be up north of 15 women who make it through the primaries and are running for governor in the general election. So that could make a real difference. And one of the reasons we pay so much attention to this level of office is this is where we pull candidates for the presidency, the United States Senate and governor's offices. So having a bench of women at this level of office is incredibly important. So that's where our numbers are right now in this year, the first major election following the election of Donald Trump. There's an awful lot of potential here for change. We can talk a little bit more when we go into the question and answer period, a little bit about what happened. You know, the last time we've seen this kind of surge was 1992 in the aftermath of the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings. There are a lot of similarities in what's going on now and what went on then. But I do want to end with a little bit of what you can do as you leave here and you look towards the future. Obviously, I always have to encourage and say to a group like this, I hope some of you will think about running for office. You don't have to run for Congress, but that would be great. But there are state legislative seats, county seats, municipal offices. We need women running at every level of office. We need them active and engaged at every level. You can become a citizen advocate. You can advocate for the issues that you care about, lobby the elected officials in your area. And then, of course, you can work for other people who are running, who you agree with, and go out and support them and be engaged. We need women engaged in every aspect of the political process because without the voices of women, we are missing talent, creativity, and energy that we so desperately need. So I'm going to end there, and we can open it up to questions.
Thank you all so much. What a great panel. Let's open it up to questions. Yes, please.
This is a question for Debbie. So, talk about 1992 Video. I actually didn't know that. I didn't realize. I heard about it, but I didn't know that there was such a surge. But that was 92, and this is now. Oh, sorry, I'm loud, but that was 90.
That was sorry, my question was just the bump with the Anita Hill case in 92, and now we are over 10 years later, over 20 years later, and still it hasn't carried forward. So even now, like, I am so excited. I saw the Avengers cover, the Time magazine Avengers cover, for those of you that haven't seen it, and I get excited, but I'm just like, how do we keep carrying it so it's not like Donald Trump Part 2 comes out in like 20 years?
So you're talking about the sustainability of what's happening. Right, right. Is this working?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to wait till the screen goes up. It's like the world's biggest screen.
You don't realize it's going up into the roof. It's amazing.
Is that where it's going? Yeah. So I'll answer that, but I think others can chime in on this because I think there's a lot of ideas about how this is sustained. I am reminded of President Obama's farewell speech when he talked about the fact that folks have to remember that elections don't happen just every 4 years. They don't even happen every 2 years. They happen every year. And so there has to be a real commitment and an understanding that all of this kind of social change, sadly, is a marathon. It is not a sprint. And it means hanging in there. And it means participating in school board elections and municipal elections and county freeholder elections and state legislative elections. And the great thing about New Jersey is we always have an election because every year is an election year for us. So it does require that kind of perseverance and that kind of engagement. And I think it's normal that there are flashpoints that ignite passions and highly motivate people. I think that's sort of the way of social movements and the way of history. But there has to be this kind of understanding that it's not going to turn around in a day. I mean, even when in 1992, in the aftermath of the Anita Hill Clarence Thomas hearings, where I think for the first time for a lot of people in this country, they really saw who made up the United States Senate, because those of you who are old enough, as I am, to remember sitting there all that weekend watching this young African-American woman speak truth to power and go before an all-male, all-white Senate Judiciary Committee, and the fact that she was not believed, at least by them. She was believed by lots and lots of people all around the country, but not enough by them, or it didn't matter enough what she was saying. I'm not sure whether it's not believing or that it just doesn't matter when a woman has this experience, particularly if a black woman has this experience, so that they could support and vote for Clarence Thomas, who sits now and will sit on the U.S. Supreme Court for as long as he likes, even though he faced that kind of an accusation. It was that moment, I think, for women collectively kind of going, where are the women? You know, who was there to understand? It was a kind of a collective recognition. And the combination of that kind of realization of the lack of representation in that institution, combined with a record number of open seats that year for Congress, led to a doubling in the number of women in Congress. But that still meant that women made up 10% of Congress at the end of the day. So this is a long haul, and it is going to take a lot of work, and we are not close to political parity, but that engagement has to be kept. It's why we do our Ready to Run program. It's why we do the program for college women. It's why we try to get schools across the country to do programs like that, so that we're demystifying the process and we are bringing more and more women in. Dan, I think you want to...
No, I just want to say that one of the other ways this sustains itself is that one of the big barriers for women running is stereotypes about female candidates. So voters have stereotypes, they believe certain things about female candidates that tend to disadvantage female candidates in some elections. However, the only way to get through that is to have more women in office. So Hillary Clinton faced a disadvantage because she was the first woman major party nominee. The only solution to that is to have more women major party nominees. And after a while, there's not a stereotype because there's not one woman. There's been a whole bunch, and the stereotypes tend to fall away. So the more women that run, the more women that win, the lower the barriers are marginally for every woman who comes afterwards. And it's also just the fact that women in the past have, one of the big barriers to women being in office was that women have a much higher barrier. So women have to be much more qualified to run than men. Men kind of assume, yeah, I'm qualified, and they run, even if they're objectively not qualified at all levels, where women hold themselves to a much higher standard. You know, a man with the same credentials would have run a long time ago, but women try and have more experience and do more before they run. And so the mere fact that we get women with more experience at lower levels means we get more women at the higher levels. And so it really takes a long time for that to build up. But trends are encouraging, as Debbie says.
Good.
Thank you all for showing up and talking about so many different things. To me, the most interesting fact was were the money facts about the Hispanic women only working, starting to work for free in July that really strikes me as horribly unfair. And when we're talking about barriers to entry, what could be a bigger barrier to entry than the lack of economic strength to allow you the freedom to move forward? And so it seems to me that all this talk about barriers that's cupcake, icing on the cupcake. What you really need is economic parity so that people can pay somebody else to watch their kids while they go knock on doors or or feed their kids while they go knock on doors, or clothe their kids while they. I mean, if you're not making enough money to have more than $5 of wealth, you're not going to run for office. So I would just like to suggest that our efforts should be on parity in pay and in work and in educational opportunities before we even think about going anywhere else. Just my take on it.
I just want to say that it becomes a circular situation. We've done research looking at the impact of women in office, and one of the things that we found is that women, and particularly women of color who serve in elective office, are exactly the people who, when they are there, take on those issues that you're talking about. So we need the women in office who carry the water, frankly. And I don't want to say that men don't support those issues, but we have found that women are more likely to have the kinds of issues that you're describing at the top of their policy agenda than their male colleagues. And it's not necessarily that the men are going to vote against it, but it's the women that are going to bring it forward and put it out there. So it's both things. We need the women in order to make the change that I think you're talking about.
Well, to follow up on that, do you see a difference in fundraising for male and female candidates?
We do know that women and men raise comparable amounts of money to each other in comparable races, but it may in fact be harder for the women to raise it than for the men. They do it, but it may be harder. And we think that oftentimes that is because the women who run for office tend to come from less moneyed networks than their male counterparts. So it may take one phone call for a man to raise $1,000, but it may take a woman 10 or 15 phone calls to raise that same amount of money. It is, and when we talk to men and women who serve in state legislatures about the difficulty that they have in raising money, there is a huge gender gap. It's probably one of the biggest gender gaps that we see, which is the women who are in office tell us that it is much harder for them to raise that money. Ironically, it may in fact be a little bit more complicated for one of the reasons we think Republican women may not be doing as well is there are networks for Democratic women who are running for office that have more money to them, frankly, than the Republican women have, which doesn't fit like what our stereotype is. But Emily's List being the big behemoth of an organization that really raises an enormous amount of money for pro-choice Democratic women candidates. There are PACs for Republican women, but they are nothing compared to an Emily's List. But we are seeing more and more new PACs out there. As I mentioned, Higher Heights, which is based in New York City, but is raising money for Black women who are running for office. There are a number of state-based PACs that are raising money for Latinas, and a national PAC called Poder PAC that is looking to raise money for Latinas to try to level that playing field a little bit more.
After every election, there is widespread commentary about the very, very low rates of voter turnout. And I am wondering whether there has been research on the gender breakdown in terms of those voters who turn out to vote, and what kinds of things we could be looking at to change that. What your thoughts are on increasing voter turnout and increasing it among women. But is there research on the gender issue with respect to voter turnout, and what can we do to affect it?
Well, women outvote men. About 9 million more women voted than men in the last, not in this, we haven't got the numbers yet for this last presidential exactly, but in the presidential before that. Women are more likely, and they also vote differently, right? We've seen a gender gap in the way in which men and women vote. And among the women, there are differences. So white married women are more likely to be Republicans. Women of color overwhelmingly more likely to be to vote Democratic. You certainly saw that in the election in Alabama, where Doug Jones' victory, I think you can largely thank the black women in Alabama for the election of Doug Jones. But we do know that women do outvote men at this point. I mean, I think there is a huge question in our country in general about how do we increase voter participation, and there are issues like same-day registration and mail ballots and all of these issues to try to increase participation. But as of right now, it's not that women are perfect on this, but women are certainly outvoting men.
To follow up on that, those of you who are working on with younger students, where do you see the young people voting? Tova, maybe?
Sure. Well, I guess I'll just say that at the time of the last presidential election, I was a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin and saw quite a lot of student surprise, the kind of shock that Debbie was describing, feeling the day after the election is what I was hearing on campus. But I'll just share an experience that I had walking around campus and hearing two undergrad students having a conversation and really upset. And one was saying, "Yeah, I just really wish I had voted," and I wondered how many people she represented who was shocked by having this whole conversation. And I assumed they had voted right up until the point where I said, where I heard her say, that she wished she had showed up. So. So I think there's still work to be done, but in my field among social work students, we hear a lot of intentionality now around thinking about the next election cycle and their role as social workers and community organizing and helping people to get to the polls.
If I could just jump in, the biggest barrier in America to voting is actually voter registration, is the fact that almost uniquely among advanced democracies, you require people to register to vote 30 or 60 days before an election. So when we do surveys of people who are not registered to vote, which is actually a really hard thing to do, because people who don't register to vote also don't pick up their damn phones, so we can't talk to them. But when we do get them, mostly through text messaging, what they tell us is the biggest reason they don't vote is, number one, they don't feel like they're qualified. They don't feel like they know enough to vote. Which in American elections, I mean, boy, I don't know how much they think other people know, but that actually is gendered. So women are more likely to say that they don't know enough to vote. So it's, again, qualifications. They feel like they have to be more qualified. And the second biggest reason is they say no one ever asked them to register. Like, no one ever said, hey, you should register to vote. And they went, oh, okay. So the implication, because someone just asked them, you'd see voter registration go up by somewhere between 6 and 7 points. So, just no one's asking.
I also wonder about the sort of persistent drive to.
You know what? I think because it's facing
the. It's just because I'm not a political scientist. It's God's way of telling me to slow down. But I also think about voter suppression. I mean, just the persistent nationwide effort to make it harder to vote. And you can see, closing down voting sites or requiring IDs and then closing all of the areas that are convenient for people to get IDs. And we know who that targets. I mean, it's no accident that in Alabama, someone drove around in a van and picked up black people to vote,
right? Like that was the goal. You had to make sure that they could get to the polls, and you had to make sure that even that they knew when they got in line. I think that when you think about how if you're a felon, you don't get to vote, right? And if your prison system is disproportionately targeting people of color, then when they get out, they can't participate in the electoral system. And if they get out and they don't have jobs and they don't feel as invested in the electoral system. So those things seem to me like a network. I think you probably know more about that than I do, though.
No, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. I also think that, I was just going to say something that, to go on what Tova was saying, I also think that there's an issue that I think after this election, I think people get in a different way that elections have consequences, right? That the candidates aren't all the same, and that who you elect really makes a difference. So I'm hoping that that helps with motivating, particularly on college campuses, students who have not been participating as much as we would like them to.
Thank you. And I appreciate all of the information that was shared tonight, too. I ran for freeholder in Morris County last year and the year before. And one of the interesting things about my candidacy was that it was two women running against each other. The Republican candidate was also a female, and we actually tipped the board of freeholders in Morris County because it now has four women as the majority instead of men for the first time in history. So that was an interesting campaign. I found my biggest issue was fundraising. And so I agree completely with everything that you said about that. In order to raise money to pay for the kind of camp, I had tremendous volunteers. I had a lot of people who really, really helped me. But I just was not able to raise, I probably self-funded about 3/4 of my campaign. And so what it does is it really cuts out people who cannot do that from even running. But my question has to do with, to Dan, and that has to do with Trump's machismo. Do you think that his sexual exploits that he's used them as a way of proving his virility and defending his manhood?
Yeah, I mean, so Trump is all about performative masculinity, right? And I hate to actually use the term masculinity because, of course, there's lots of different ways to be a man. But he is very much going into what the gender theorists call hegemonic masculinity. You know, male is domineering, male is having sexual exploits. Look, I think there's a reason that we found out last week that our current president had an affair with an actress from pornography. I hate they all call them porn stars, so it might be character actors, from a pornographic actress from pornographic movies, while his wife was at home with their infant child and paid her off for $130,000. And that was like 5 news stories ago, and we're not really worried about that anymore. Because it's part and parcel. We go, oh yeah, I do that, right? That is performative masculinity. And it's really kind of the darkest, worst aspects of masculinity that we were seeing in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. And I do think that sort of masculinity in most parts of America is dying out. But Donald Trump is very much kind of a last gasp. And I think you see that actually people talk about the race breakdowns in voting and the gender breakdowns. I think the age breakdown is almost more interesting to me. So, for instance, after the Access Hollywood tapes came down, Trump's numbers went down across the board, except among older white men who liked him a little better and older white women who liked him a little better. These beliefs about gender and proper gender roles and beliefs in the value of hegemonic masculinity are not exclusive to men. There's a lot of older women who also feel that they want men to dominate. Maybe these are women who were homemakers their whole lives. And to say, no, women are valuable when they're running for office, women are valuable when they're running corporations, that feels like an attack on them. And they feel attacked by that. And so I think there is an appeal to that. The sort of performative masculinity does appeal to a certain coalition of voters. However, I do think that coalition of voters is shrinking. I think it's not working as well as it might have worked 20 or 30 years ago because there's just fewer people who have those sort of attitudes. I think more people are moving on. I hope that masculinity is changing so that that sort of masculinity feels more toxic to more people.
I think you had your hand up before. Yeah.
just wanted to thank the panelists. I wanted to thank Patricia for her comment about the racial disparity and the differences. And also wanted to thank Debbie, because I have actually attended at least 2 of the Ready to Run, and as well as the Sister to Run, and I've held office in my community. I'm actually up for re-election in May, running for my 2nd term on my town council. Well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that, but I also noticed that I'm the only Black woman, I think, in the room. And so that just speaks to some of the points that I'm sorry, excluding, with the exception, of course, of the panelists and the audience, let me clarify that. But I just really appreciate the efforts that you're working with women of color and how challenging it is. And to the points of the financial component that one of the audience members were making and the sacrifice. I ran on my school board. I was sat for 10 years, and my biggest regret is that I didn't spend as much time with my own children, my own issues, because I was so busy championing the issues, as you said, because it was relevant to me. And on my town council, I'm championing the issues about making sure our community is age-friendly, making sure the social issues, the educational issues are there, whereas most of my colleagues are just concerned about development and all the financial components. So that just speaks to your point as to why it is so important. And not that I'm not concerned about those issues, but I want to make sure that these other issues that are about the quality of life, which to me as a nurturer, as a mom, in my community, are relevant. So my question really is to the point of, with the current political climate, do you feel that there would be more financial support? Because that is a huge issue. Do you think that the march that's coming up on Saturday and the fact that there is still women's movement, do you think that there would be more support, more financial support from both ends, gender in terms of male support as well as female support?
For women candidates? Yeah, look, I think we are looking at a wave election come 2018, November 2018. And I think the energy and the enthusiasm for women who are running as Democrats is high. I think we have seen, I am anticipating that at the very top level, organizations like Emily's List are going to probably have one of their best years in terms of raising money. We work very closely with Higher Heights, which is why I keep referencing them. We've done a lot of work with them. I think they're anticipating a good year for raising money to then give to women candidates. I think things are pointing in a very positive direction on that front. I still think it's going to be a challenge for women. One of the challenges is that women tend not to give at the same level that men do in politics. It is understandable. Women have, frankly, less disposable income. And I think for a lot of women in the past, they have felt that their giving is better, is more effective in the nonprofit sector than in politics. That they don't see politics as the place to solve the problems on the issues that they care about, so they give their money more philanthropically than they do to politics. I think in some ways it's part of why one of the challenges we face when women think about running for office. We know that men tell us, the men who are in office tell us the reason that they ran the very first time was because they had a long-standing interest in careers in politics, and women tell us that the reason that they ran for office was because they wanted to fix a problem. You know, we talk about that as men run to be somebody and women run to do something. And if you want to do something, you may well look at government and politics and say, nothing gets done there, right? I mean, that's the place where ideas go to die in Washington. And that's everybody's kind of image of politics is Washington, even though a whole lot gets done at the municipal level, as you well know. But so women don't make a decision not to run for office because they have a problem they want to fix, so they go work in the nonprofit sector in the same way that they think there's a problem to fix. They don't think about investing in candidates, they think about investing in philanthropy. I think that will be changing, and we don't know yet. I mean, we're just at the beginning of kind of watching this cycle and seeing what happens with the money, but I think that some of those ideas about where to put your dollars, big dollars or small dollars, may be shifting.
Yeah, right next to you.
Yes.
Well, I've been around for a while, it's obvious, and I've been there, done that. I've run for office. I've served on my town council. I ran for freeholder once. But what I think is missing from this discussion is any talk about the political parties and how they are organized and what their role is. And in New Jersey, we have equality at the political party level. Under our election law, every voting district is entitled to have a committee woman and a committee man. So if women get involved in their party organization, that's a good first step. Right. And get to be chairman, yeah, then you decide ballot position, all sorts of important things. You decide who's probably going to win the primary because they've gotten endorsement.
Right.
Yeah. So that's certainly an important place for women to be involved.
Yeah, I think on paper, the parties look like there is great potential there for political parity. We don't see that playing out. New Jersey is a complicated state, to say the least. So it is true that every county, for instance, has a party chair, both sides, Democrats and Republicans, and there's also a vice chair. Overwhelmingly, the chairs are men, and there has to be gender balance. So if the chair is a man, the vice chair is a woman. Overwhelmingly, the chairs of the county parties are men, and the vice chairs are women. They could change that.
By being committee members.
Yes.
That's who elects the chairman.
Absolutely, but oftentimes this system, I'm going to sound like a Bernie Sanders person, the system is often kind of rigged against having that open transparency. And in many places, the person who is the county party chair may not really have the power. The person who has the power may be somebody who is not even elected. So for instance, in South Jersey, George Norcross runs the party. And not just in one county, but in a whole series of counties. He's elected to by nobody.
What women serving at committee level can put an end to.
Yeah, I think they're there, but they're not able because of, and there's a whole issue of money and contracts, and it is terribly, terribly difficult. And it is one of the reasons that women have really struggled in the state of New Jersey to make gains. The political party structure is such that it is very much an old boys club that really keeps newcomers, women and people of color, out. And it has been a struggle. And we encourage women to run for party positions. Many of those slots sit vacant, but right, but even when they get there, they find that decisions are made before the meeting even happens. So it's been a real struggle in New Jersey.
Yeah, New Jersey.
There was a hand like right there. Oh, sorry. No.
Somebody over there?
Go ahead. Yes, please.
Good. Okay. I want to go back to that subject of sustainability. We've had a lot of candidates come out this year, women candidates come out. You talked about with Anita Hill, there was a surge for a short period of time that went away. We also talked about men who are now starting to feel, with children being born, that they have a sense of their children and especially their daughters, and safety and moving forward for them. You said that a lot of women came out this year because they were concerned for their daughters. I'm concerned for my daughters and granddaughters and things like that. How do you see sustainability in this activism movement right now? How do we keep it going? Is it a fear of what's going to happen to my daughter, the consequences of election, or is it a carrot? What are the things that can sustain a movement like this going forward?
I'm a little hopeful because I talk to young people a lot, particularly young women. I was not prepared for the response of the women students in my class after the election who were openly weeping at some point. And then they got back up. And I think that we're going to see organizing. I don't know how much that will go into elected positions, but I think you're going to see more and more grassroots organizations. I spend a lot of time on social media, and I see a lot of young people organizing virtually, cultural conferences, critiques of the prison industrial system, thinking about gender, even the TV shows or even the movies that we see. So I don't think that like electoral politics is the only path there. I think that sustainability happens when we have those conversations across different arenas, and I think success begets success, right? Every time, I think if you even think about the Me Too movement, which we all kind of referenced, it was the quick response to Weinstein, right? However long that lasts, that made other people feel like it was worth it to take that step. And I think that's going to happen in different ways. That's the only thing that gives me hope. I talk to young people, and they don't want this to be the world, right? I think that a lot of them only knew Obama as a president, right? They only knew Michelle Obama as a first lady. And I remember in a class, a student telling me, it was a young African-American woman, she said, I thought we fought all these battles. I can't believe I got to fight him again. But she's ready, right? She's ready. So I'm hopeful.
How about the men? Where do we see the young men?
Well, I just want to add one thing first, and I did want to echo what Tricia was just saying in terms of hopefulness around students. I was at a conference last week, my discipline's major research conference, and students mobilized and were wearing all black one day at the conference, following the lead of the actresses and actors who did that at the Golden Globe Awards. And I think, both I see this energy and mobilizing by students, but also this leaping across sectors is kind of exciting too. So, I think you gave the example of actresses bringing activists with them along, and here we see students following the lead of what they saw in the press there. So I think, one thing that makes me hopeful is just thinking about, the broader this gets, then, it picks up momentum. In terms of where the men are, I think, one thing that I think has a lot of potential is just thinking about the change that happens now as having an impact across generations. So when we see, Dan's talking about changing definitions of masculinity and that it's fluid, when we see change, we know that, being raised by a more nurturing father, it's predictive of the kind of caregivers and kind of partners that boys will grow up to be, and it matters too for what girls expect from the men in their lives as they grow up. So so I think part of where the sustainability and the change comes from is if we can get kind of a critical mass of change now that it continues to play out over time.
I think we have one last question on that side.
Thank you. So the rationale for this gathering tonight is that this is sort of a seminal moment and want to capitalize on it and look at what's going on in this country. And the panelists spoke from different angles to the topic. My question is, do any of you see what's happening in America now influencing the rest of the world, or either directly influencing what's happening in other places, or a reverberation similar around the world?
So I can take that a little bit. So when we look at the data, what's really interesting is that we have a gender gap in the United States, and people talk about that in terms of women are more democratic than men are, and that goes historically. That's not even that has been true for very long. That goes back to about the era of the ERA, right, when women started becoming more democratic. But what's interesting is around the world, there's only a few countries that actually have a gender gap like that. Our gender gap, we get it here. You see it to a lesser extent in Australia, and that's kind of it for the developed world. Why? Because what you see right now is you're seeing women mobilize, as Tove was saying, with this fear, with this fear of loss. Like, oh my God, we're going to lose this. I thought we won these battles. If you live in Sweden and gender issues are not already something that's legislated and dealt with, and you've got parental leave and abortion rights already, then women are voting on the same issues that men are, and you don't see a gender gap at all. So this is kind of a, sadly, almost uniquely American phenomenon. We have seen these sort of huge swings in other elections in other countries. I believe Rwanda, in one election, went from being 12% of the legislature being women to 80% in one election. That actually led to, after that, their scores on almost every indicator you can think of went up pretty dramatically. They made a pretty big difference there. So it has happened in other countries, but it is kind of weirdly, uniquely American for all sorts of terrible reasons.
I also just want to add that we do not lead the world when it comes to how women are doing. Dan was referencing it to policy, but we rank 91st in the nation, in the country, in the world, for the proportion of women in our national legislature. Rwanda is number 1, but we are behind places like Kazakhstan. We are behind Iraq. And part of the reasons we're behind Iraq is because when Iraq was forming its new government with a new constitution, the United States insisted at the time that there would be a quota in Iraq for 25% of its parliament to be made up of women, for reasons that make a lot of sense. I mean, we the perspectives and the kind of attention to issues of peace and diplomacy that are associated with women. We valued enough to make sure that in a country where we were having some say and control over what would happen, that we did it. It won't happen in this country. We could have a long conversation about quotas, but a lot of these countries are doing so much better because there are quotas.
One super last question.
I will try to talk quickly. I'm sorry. Thank you for this panel tonight. I've really enjoyed it, and I've enjoyed how much of it has been focused on getting women into office. But I'm curious as to sort of going back to the sustainability issue and all of the conversations that we have amongst ourselves, like the Me Too conversation, and amongst my activist circle right now, there's a lively debate in advance of the next Women's March as to whether or not the pussy hats are exclusionary. And I'm wondering if when conversations within Me Too are trivialized or called distractions, and with conversations like this debate are kind of called distractions and identity politics within feminism, if it's possible to walk and chew gum at the same time, and if we can have these conversations and remain a healthy movement, or if at some point we need to just focus on getting women to office. And I don't know who would like to pick that up, but I'm just really curious about the room for lively debate and conversation, and also sustainability as a movement for feminism.
I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time, but I think it becomes a question of resources, right? Where are you going to put that energy? So we can think about it and we can talk about it, but you can only be at one march at a time, right? And so I think that's part of the problem, and I think that there is a sense that there's not a lot of room for the theoretical right now, because just on a material level, there's so much at stake. And I think that every group that wants to have its conversation has to almost fight the same battle, right? That's, I think, to go back to Clifton for a second, everybody has to insist that their memories matter, and no group is excluded from being resistant to bringing in somebody who's from the margins, right? So I identify as female, and when I think about trans issues, I hear myself going through the exact same steps that I know that white people have gone through in thinking about race. I'd love to think that I'm so evolved and I get it, and if you give me a clipboard, I'll check every box in the exact right way. But when it's people, right, in the real world, I'm like, oh my God, who am I, right? And I learn those lessons, but I have to learn them with people. So everybody has to go through those stages. But I do think you're right. I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Yeah. I think we have to bring our program to a close, but what did you think? Was this something? So I want to thank you all for a very informative evening, and we learned a lot, and we have a long way to go, and we're going to learn more. Thank you so much. Thank you.